Home one stormy night in the early years of the 20th century, when no one was on the street, not even the police, or as Democrata says, not even the animals who had taken shelter. He saw the hunched figure of this little man wearing no coat but a hat. And he stopped and said to him, "Father DuPont, are you mad? You will be dead by next week if you proceed." And DuPont said, "I have no care. I carry with me the Blessed Sacrament, and I'm going because I have been called by someone down the lane who is about to die and whose eternal future is much more important to me than my physical health." I'm old enough to remember the witness of Mary Oliver Semmes, a New Orleans Jesuit in the early middle years of the century. A man who, like Jesus, had no more than one cloak, and it wasn't a seamless garment like his Lord had. Yes? Despised by many, although priest he was, white man, a position of privilege that he may have occupied in the society at the time, and who was at Holy Trinity Cathedral, and who, when there was an outbreak of yaws in the Parade Gardens region, he and no one else, there was no Salvation Army at the time, there was no public health system. It was he who would go into Rum Lane and Maiden Lane and Stephen Street and Hannah Street, and he would wash and bind up the sores of those who were afflicted, and more so, who walked to King's House, a modern bogle some might say, to petition Governor Huggins that it was time to have a proper public health campaign that would rid the areas that he served in of the sewerage and the muck that was incubating that disease. Years later, it was the Jamaican Randolph Ferguson, may God rest his soul, many of you know him, yes? Who walked fearlessly in a time when downtown warfare was the order of the day, and who had no fear, and who stopped on every street corner and spoke to everyone without a penny in his pocket, but with a word of salvation in his soul. When other ministers of religion wouldn't go because God knows how fearful and macabre and awful it is, when others would not go, David Carroll, Alwyn Harry, the great Jamaican Jesuit, would not fail and flinch. Brian Massey, the Canadian, later on, to go and walk with the condemned men to the gallows in Spanish Town. Harry took me on 4 occasions. I will never, never forget. Never, never forget the sight of the willful killing of a human person for whatever reason, with whatever guilt, and sometimes with no guilt. And it was those men who stood for justice. It was Alwyn Harry and Kenneth Ramsey, the Jamaican priest still alive, who camped out with us on the grounds of King's House to plead for the lives of some of those persons who we knew did not deserve to die. And there are so many other instances of where faith, your faith, my faith, takes us to the extraordinary levels and witness of the presence of God in our society that transcends numbers and goes to the heart of human existence. I remember George Maggot. George Maggot was a drunk who became a street person several years ago, perhaps 25 years now. Yeah? And he lived for some months in desperation, absolute desperation, tried to kill himself under the bridge at Malines Road. And men stoned him because you know how we are sometimes, the brutality that exists, and he got some terrible cuts on his face, and they became infested with maggots, and he was rotting away. And it was in the Star, and nobody would go and touch him. Yes? And thank God it was the women of the Salvation Army who were brave enough to go. And they borrowed the van from the pastor at our church, St. Elizabeth's on Ransford Avenue. And they went, and they said, "Come, love." And in distress, but he was too weak to protest, he went. And where did they take him? Saints of Deanery 6, they took him down to Mother Teresa's on Tower Street and Gold Street. The little sisters there, when they saw him stinking with death while he was yet alive, yes? Out of what? Humanism? Out of what? Hope for earthly reward? No. Out of a consciousness that they were dealing with the image and likeness of their Savior. Yes? Took him. And I remember watching in disbelief as they kissed him. And they took him inside and they bathed him and cleaned him. And they picked out every one of the maggots from his head side. His whole skull was apparent, his face gone. And then Dr. Raje from the university came and gave medical help. And Archbishop Carter baptized him. And Monsignor Albert was the godfather. And George lived for another 3 days. And he died in the arms of his Lord. That's what Catholicism means. That's what Jamaican Catholicism implies. Up at my church in Gordon Town, I remember the story of, not the story, the reality. Yeah, I knew her, this woman. Maybe some of you have heard me tell her before. She was my beauty queen. Yes, my beauty queen. A woman of incalculable beauty. She had one tooth in her head. And she had grown up in the district. And she had fallen into company with a man. And she had had 4 children from him, but he was a drunkard. And he would beat her and abuse her in the square at Gordon Town. And eventually, he left her for a brunette in Vineyard Town. And she tried her best with the children, and as she would tell me with her smile, she would say she carried them past the worst. You know the expression, Catholic faith have experiences not dissimilar to this one. And years after, he came back to Gordon Town, that man did, but this time he was not full of arrogance and cursing. He was clutching his belly because he had contracted cancer of the stomach or somewhere, and he was smelly and awful, and the very woman who had come and taken him away had now put him out, and he was coming back. And my sister, strengthened and emboldened by the teachings of her faith, that has as its first principle the defense of life. Yes? When people ask you what Catholics believe, point to them, the Holy Fathers, John Paul II, Benedict, John the 23rd, all of them. No religious organization, no human institution, ours being both human and divine as Jesus is, defends life. Life in all aspects, life from conception to natural end, as vigorously and as principally as the Roman Catholic Church. And so my sister took him back in, you know, and we visited the St. Vincent de Paul in her little house perched on the hillside, maybe like yours, a couple of weeks later. And you should have seen what we saw. Because he was in the bed, the only bed that the St. Vincent de Paul had recently given her. And he was clean and in pajamas, and you know him, chest powder up. And there was sign of the banana bark on the ground of the floor where she was sleeping. And he died a couple of months later. And